A racist judge threw a black woman out of the courtroom, not because she broke a rule, not because she disrespected the court, but simply because she asked to see public documents during a scheduled audit, a right she legally held. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were enough to echo through every corner of that silent courtroom and strike harder than any scream. He looked her up and down, condescending, calculating, and dismissive, before saying coldly, "You people think you can walk into any place and demand respect. Not in my courtroom. Get her out of here." No warning. No reason. Just a quiet order that triggered loud consequences. The security officers hesitated, not because they disagreed, but because they were uncomfortable with how familiar that moment felt. She stood still, trying to hold on to her composure, her dignity clashing with a rage that burned deep in her chest. She glanced around the room and saw the silence of complicity, lawyers who refused to meet her eyes, clerks who suddenly found their papers more interesting, and the judge, leaning back in his chair like a man who had done this before and never been questioned. And then, as they led her out, her voice broke through the air like a blade, "One day, you'll regret this. One day, you'll wish you hadn't done what you just did." He scoffed. The courtroom laughed. But outside those heavy doors, a storm was building, and not the kind that passes quietly. The kind that reshapes everything in its path. What that judge didn't know, what not a single soul in that room imagined, was that the woman he had just humiliated was not just another case auditor. She wasn't a clerk. She wasn't lost or misplaced in that room. She was placed there, intentionally, because behind the scenes, a much bigger shift was underway. She was, in fact, the very person chosen to clean that court from the inside out. And he had just become her first case. Because in less than a week, the gavel he used to silence her would be in her hands. Not as a protester. Not as a plaintiff. But as his judge. The courtroom had seen many things over the years: injustice, silence, victory, and shame. But it had never seen what was about to happen next. What began as a simple audit turned into a national headline. The clip of her being removed spread fast. At first, just a few tweets. Then, a viral explosion. Lawyers who had once been silenced by the same judge started speaking up. Accusations emerged. Patterns. Evidence. And while the storm raged online, inside that building, something far more dangerous was unfolding: truth. A truth that had been buried under years of entitlement and silence. And yet, the most powerful part of this story is not just the downfall of a man who thought he owned the courtroom, but the rise of a woman who was never meant to survive it. She had faced judges like him before, in law school, in interviews, in boardrooms where she was always too confident or too ambitious or not a good fit. She had built her entire career swallowing words and controlling the urge to fight back. But this time, it was different. This time, she didn't need to prove she belonged. She was the system now. Every file she opened revealed a web of corruption, favoritism, and systemic injustice that this man had protected under his robe. His record of biased rulings. His private emails. His complaints, covered up or ignored. She didn't just want justice for herself, she was about to deliver justice for every person he had silenced with that same sneer, that same dismissive voice, that same abuse of power. Still, she didn't make it personal. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She waited. She studied. She let the walls close in on him naturally, through the very system he thought he controlled. And when the moment came, when he walked into the room expecting a disciplinary hearing, only to see her sitting at the head of the table, papers in hand, silence filling the space he once dominated, it wasn't rage on her face. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes only when you know the fight is over and you've already won. But how did she get there? How did the woman who was dragged out of a courtroom become the one holding the power to take it all down? What happened between that moment of humiliation and the final moment of reckoning that stunned an entire courthouse and made national news? There's a story behind her silence. There's a reason she didn't fight back right away. There's a secret that turns this entire story upside down, one decision that changed everything and caught even her off guard. The question is, what was it? And when the final verdict is delivered, will justice be enough, or is revenge the only thing that ever truly satisfies? Stay with us. You need to hear this one to the end. Before we begin, we want to say this loud and clear: Plow of Twist stands firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To every black viewer watching this, your voice, your presence, and your power matter. This story, like so many others we share, is told with respect for your resilience, your truth, and your fight for justice. Thank you for being here. Now, buckle up, because this story is going to move you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another twist. Let's get into it. The courthouse in Augusta, Georgia, looked the same way it always had, a solid gray mass of stone, pillars, and polished floors echoing with the footsteps of law clerks and officers trying to look busy. The old structure had history in every brick, but for some, it wasn't a proud one. For many black professionals who walked through those doors, it carried the weight of generations, of exclusion, of silence, of having to speak twice as carefully and be twice as prepared just to be heard. For Amara Daniels, though, the courthouse wasn't just a building. It was a battlefield. And like most people who had learned to survive them, she entered not looking for war, but always prepared for one. Amara was in her late 30s, calm in her presence but unshakable in her conviction. She had a quiet strength that came from years of being underestimated, interrupted, and overlooked. Her dark brown eyes were sharp, observant, and had the unsettling ability to make even the most confident man stumble over his words. She didn't smile much, not because she wasn't kind, but because she had long learned that her smile was often mistaken for weakness. Her locks were always neatly tied back, and her clothes spoke of function over flair, tailored, minimalist, and always sharp. She carried herself with purpose, the kind of woman who didn't need to prove her worth because she had already done that, time and time again, in rooms that never wanted her there in the first place. She had grown up in Richmond, Virginia, the daughter of a retired schoolteacher and a sanitation worker, both fiercely proud and radically honest people who taught her that justice wasn't something you were given, it was something you had to fight for, inch by inch. Amara didn't become a lawyer for prestige or power. She did it because she hated watching her community get dismissed in courtrooms by people who didn't understand their stories, and worse, didn't care to. She had started as a public defender, taking the cases no one wanted, defending young black boys painted as threats before they even spoke. Over the years, she moved into civil rights litigation, exposing housing discrimination, wage theft, and police misconduct. Her work was not glamorous, but it was necessary. And that made her enemies. But it also earned her something else: respect. Not the performative kind, but real, reluctant respect, even from people who didn't want to give it. Which is why, when she was appointed by a federal oversight committee to audit judicial practices in the Southern District, most people in legal circles took notice. It was a quiet appointment, made without press, without fanfare, but everyone who mattered knew what it meant. She was there to clean house. And yet, when she walked into courtroom 3B of the Richmond County Courthouse that Monday morning, she wasn't thinking about politics. She wasn't thinking about her role or her reputation. She was thinking about the documents she had requested: transcripts, case logs, and docket summaries from the last 5 years. These were routine materials, public records, easily accessible to any official assigned to the audit. But nothing was ever routine when it involved Judge Franklin MacArthur. Judge MacArthur was the kind of man who believed that the law was not just a tool, it was his tool. Appointed nearly 20 years ago, he had built a reputation as a hardliner, someone who prided himself on keeping order and showing discipline in the courtroom. But behind the language of professionalism was a much darker pattern, a trail of rulings and behaviors that often tilted sharply against black defendants, immigrants, and anyone he deemed as challenging his authority. His courtroom wasn't a place of justice. It was a stage, and he was the main act. No one interrupted. No one questioned. And certainly, no one walked in asking for documents without his say-so. That morning, as Amara walked up the side aisle of the courtroom and handed her formal audit request to the clerk, she could already feel the tension. She saw MacArthur glance down from his bench, expression unreadable, fingers drumming lightly on his gavel. She wasn't there to make a scene. Her presence was protocol. But protocol never mattered to men who felt power slipping through their hands. The courtroom was mid-session. A civil hearing. 2 attorneys at the front. The judge nodded for one to continue, but his eyes kept darting back toward Amara. She stood silently, off to the side, waiting for acknowledgement. None came. The case wrapped, people began filing out, and MacArthur finally spoke, his voice smooth, almost theatrical. "Ms. Daniels, is it?" She nodded, politely. "This is not how we conduct requests in my courtroom. You don't just show up unannounced and demand files like it's some kind of open archive." Amara responded calmly, referencing the audit order and her appointment credentials. She even offered to return later, in private, if that was more convenient. But her tone, measured and confident, only made it worse. Something in MacArthur's expression shifted, the mask slipping just slightly. "You people always think you can bend the rules when it suits you. This isn't your office, and this isn't your system to walk into like you own it. I don't care what papers you bring me. You don't belong here, and you're disrupting my courtroom." A silence fell. A heavy one. The kind that clings to the air. She looked around, at the stunned interns, the clerks frozen behind their desks, even the bailiff unsure whether to step forward. Amara took a breath. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't shout. She simply said, "With all due respect, Judge, I'm here under the authority of the Federal Oversight Commission. This is not a request. It's a duty." That's when he stood. His voice hardened. "Remove her. No legal grounds. No justification. Just raw, exposed disdain." And as 2 officers approached her, not aggressive but firm, she let them take her arm. She walked out without resistance. But everyone who saw her face in that moment, calm, composed, unreadable, knew something had changed. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't shaken. She was patient. Like someone who had just added one more name to a list she had been building for years. Outside, as the courtroom doors shut behind her, she didn't call anyone. Didn't post a video. She simply walked back to her car, sat in silence for a moment, and smiled, just barely. Because she knew what was coming next. What no one in that room realized, not the clerks, not the security officers, not even the smug-faced judge, was that Amara wasn't just auditing cases. She was auditing patterns. And MacArthur had just handed her more evidence than she could have asked for. Not in paperwork. But in behavior. And now, for the first time in a long career of fighting uphill battles, she wouldn't have to knock on the door to be heard. Because the next time she returned to that courthouse, she wouldn't be asking for permission. She'd be giving orders. And when that moment came, when Judge Franklin MacArthur saw who was sitting in judgment of him, the silence would speak louder than any gavel ever could. The morning after the incident, Amara didn't change her routine. She still poured her black coffee into the same stainless steel mug, still tied her locks into the same tight knot at the back of her head, still checked her email before the sun rose and reviewed court records with the same obsessive attention to detail that had become second nature over the years. But something inside her had shifted. Something quiet but unrelenting. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind that hits after years of being patient, after swallowing every dismissive glance and every door shut in your face, after building a name for yourself while others tried to erase it in whispers. She had always played by the rules, even when those rules were made to trap her. But now, the game had changed. She wasn't here to play anymore. She was here to rewrite the board. Inside the Oversight Commission office, the air was tense with quiet outrage. Her colleague, Miguel Ruiz, sat across from her, flipping through a thick file labeled, "MacArthur, Judicial Conduct." His voice was low, but his frustration was barely contained. He said that what happened wasn't just a violation of audit protocol, it was a direct challenge to federal authority. He wanted to escalate. File a motion. Go public. Amara stopped him. Her voice was even, but firm. Not yet. Not like this. She told him that exposure was only effective when it was undeniable. If they moved too soon, it would be spun as a misunderstanding, or worse, as her being confrontational, unprofessional, angry, all the familiar labels they'd pinned on black women who dared to assert themselves. She wanted a pattern. A solid, undeniable web of misconduct so thorough that even his defenders would be forced into silence. And she knew exactly how to get it. Over the next few weeks, Amara worked in silence, but not in secret. She filed formal requests, scheduled interviews with former court employees, pulled case records, requested transcripts from hearings MacArthur had presided over, especially those involving defendants of color. What she found was worse than she expected. Patterns of disparate sentencing, evidence of suppressed testimonies, complaints quietly dropped, reprimands buried. She met with a former court interpreter who left after being told not to bother translating everything for certain defendants. A retired bailiff told her that MacArthur routinely held sidebar conversations with prosecutors but never defense attorneys. A paralegal showed her emails where he mocked a public defender's diversity agenda and called an Afro-Latina attorney emotional. Each interview added weight to the truth she already knew. But it wasn't enough for her to know it. She needed proof. Undeniable, documented, and admissible. One afternoon, she sat down with Carmen Davis, a soft-spoken former clerk who had worked under MacArthur for 6 years. Carmen was nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. She explained that she had seen complaints come through that were supposed to be forwarded to the Judicial Ethics Board, complaints from defendants, from attorneys, even from jurors. But MacArthur would intercept them. Some he trashed. Others he responded to himself, using the court letterhead. Carmen handed Amara a thumb drive, eyes wide with fear. On it were scans she had secretly saved, complaints with notes in the margins, emails between MacArthur and his allies, even internal memos showing he had been warned about his behavior years ago but was protected by his seniority and connections. Amara took the drive, thanked her, and didn't say much else. But her mind was racing. This was it. This wasn't just a pattern, it was obstruction. It was abuse of power. It was judicial misconduct on a level that could trigger federal disciplinary action. And now, she had it in her hands. The next step was to present it. But she wouldn't take it to the press. Not yet. That would be too easy for them to spin. She would take it to the Judicial Review Board, the same body that had assigned her in the first place. And when they asked her to deliver the findings in person, she made a quiet request: hold the hearing at the Richmond County Courthouse. It was procedural, she said. More efficient. Easier access to case materials. What she didn't say was that MacArthur would be there. The week leading up to the hearing was a storm of quiet preparation. She moved carefully, deliberately. She avoided unnecessary contact, made no public statements. But behind closed doors, she was building something monumental. Every document had a purpose. Every timestamp matched. Every testimony was recorded, verified, locked into place. And still, she didn't feel satisfaction. Only focus. This wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. She wasn't here to humiliate him. She was here to expose the system that allowed him to thrive. Meanwhile, whispers had started to spread inside the courthouse. The same interns and clerks who had watched her get removed now eyed her warily in the hallways. Some offered tight nods of solidarity. Others looked away. And then there were those who resented her, who saw her presence as a threat to their routines, their promotions, their comfort. MacArthur himself seemed unfazed. He continued presiding as usual, but there was a tension in his posture, a new caution in his tone. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know how close it was. The morning of the review hearing arrived with a gray, clouded sky. Amara wore her sharpest navy blue suit, the same one she had worn during her final interview with the Oversight Commission, a silent reminder of how far she had come, and how much further she still intended to go. She entered the courthouse without fanfare, but her presence turned heads. This time, no one dared stop her. Inside the hearing room, the same chamber where MacArthur had once ruled without challenge, the seats were filled with legal officials, auditors, and review board members. At the front sat a panel of 3 senior ethics judges. At their request, MacArthur was present, seated quietly to the side, arms crossed, face unreadable. He hadn't been informed of the full nature of the hearing. Just that it involved audit findings that may concern his courtroom. Amara stood at the front. She didn't speak with fire. She didn't need to. Her voice was steady, her language clinical, each word backed by documents displayed on the projection screen. Patterns of bias. Violations of judicial procedure. Suppressed complaints. Witnesses intimidated. She showed the forged responses, the intercepted emails, the altered records. Her tone never wavered. She never looked at MacArthur. But the room did. Over and over again. At one point, one of the review board members interrupted her. "And you're saying this pattern was consistent over how many years?" She replied, "At least 10. But the documented obstruction spans 6, directly involving the judge in question." There was a silence. Then came the question she knew would come, "Ms. Daniels, how did you come across this information?" She looked up, calm. "Because I was there. I saw it happen. And I refused to walk away." MacArthur leaned forward then, voice tight. "You expect them to believe you? That you walked in here like you owned the place, demanded access, and now you're suddenly qualified to?" He was cut off. "Enough," said one of the ethics judges. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't even look his way. The documents spoke for themselves now. And yet, she hadn't revealed everything. Not yet. Because there was one final piece of evidence. One final name. One detail that no one else in the room knew, not even MacArthur. A name signed on a cover letter. A connection so close, so intimate, it would change everything they thought they understood about power, about oversight, about who really controlled what. And when that final document was placed on the table, when that name was read aloud, it would leave the room in silence. That moment hadn't come yet. But it was coming. And no one, not even her, was ready for what it would expose. The room had gone quiet, not with shock yet, but with anticipation. The kind of stillness that settles just before thunder cracks the sky open. The ethics committee sat unmoving behind the long oak bench, eyes sharp but unreadable, their pens no longer scribbling on legal pads but resting beside folded hands. The small audience in the chamber, lawyers, clerks, officers, staff, had all stopped pretending to take notes or whisper to one another. They were watching. Waiting. The woman standing at the center of the storm hadn't flinched once. Amara Daniels stood with her back straight and her voice steady, but her pulse beat so loud in her ears she almost didn't hear the quiet tap of her own finger against the podium. This was the moment. Behind her, projected on the screen, was the final slide. A document that didn't look like much. It was a scanned letter, dated a little over 6 months ago. A standard judicial appointment notice. But the signature at the bottom, the name that had yet to be addressed, was not just administrative. It was intentional. She inhaled once, slowly, then turned to face the board. "This final exhibit," she said, eyes flicking toward the panel before meeting the gaze of the judge seated at the far end of the room, was issued and approved at the federal level, as part of a nationwide initiative to restructure and oversee high-risk judicial districts based on repeated misconduct indicators. One of the committee members adjusted his glasses, leaning forward. "You're referring to the oversight restructuring effort." "We're familiar," Amara nodded. "Yes, sir. However, what has not been disclosed, until now, is the appointment that followed." At that moment, she clicked the remote in her hand. The document zoomed in on the screen, and all eyes snapped to the name that now took up the width of the display. Signed in bold, black ink, Amara S. Daniels, Chief Judicial Inspector, 12th District Oversight Committee. It took only a second, but the ripple was instant. The silence cracked into gasps and murmurs. A few heads turned so sharply it echoed in the chamber. At the far end of the room, Judge Franklin MacArthur shifted in his seat. Slowly. His arms uncrossed, his jaw tightened, and for the first time since she entered the courthouse again, his eyes met hers, really met them. His confusion gave way to understanding. And then disbelief. He didn't speak. Not yet. One of the committee members finally found words. "Ms. Daniels, this letter confirms you were appointed as Chief Judicial Inspector, overseeing this courthouse." "Yes," she answered. "That includes review authority, disciplinary oversight, and administrative power over all current judicial positions in this district. Including the one held by Judge MacArthur." It was then that MacArthur stood, and his voice, hoarse but defiant, finally cut through the air. "This is outrageous. This is a conflict of interest. She has a vendetta against me. This entire proceeding is compromised." Amara didn't turn to him yet. Her gaze stayed with the panel. "This isn't about personal vendettas. This is about documented misconduct. About years of unchecked abuse. And about the integrity of this institution." The lead committee member raised a hand to quiet the tension rising around them. "Judge MacArthur, please remain seated. You'll have an opportunity to respond formally. But at this moment, we are not debating personal history. We are reviewing federal appointment and evidence presented in official audit proceedings." But MacArthur's restraint was gone. "She was removed from my courtroom. By force. And now you're telling me she was sent here with the power to take my position? This isn't oversight. It's a setup." Amara turned to face him now, fully. Her voice, though not raised, struck with more force than any outburst. "I didn't remove myself from your courtroom, Judge. You did. You made that decision when you assumed your power put you above accountability. When you silenced complaints, altered records, and punished people for not fitting into your image of who deserves justice." He scoffed, pacing now. "I've served in this building longer than anyone in this room. I've sentenced murderers, traffickers, thieves. You think I care about your little career climb?" She stepped forward, not aggressive, but present. Commanding. "This isn't about me. It never was. It's about the families who walked into your court hoping for fairness and left with broken lives. It's about the attorneys you mocked behind closed doors, the interpreters you disrespected, the clerks you used to shield your corruption. You thought your robe would protect you from consequences. But robes don't hide everything. And today, they won't hide you." The weight of her words landed like concrete across the room. No one moved. Even the stenographer had paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The gravity of what was unfolding was no longer theoretical. This wasn't just about documents and audits. This was about power being taken back, publicly, legally, and in a way that stripped every illusion MacArthur had clung to. The committee chair broke the silence. "Given the evidence, the appointed authority, and the presented violations, this board will deliberate and return with a formal disciplinary recommendation within 72 hours. Until that time, Judge MacArthur is to step away from all judicial duties pending the outcome." MacArthur didn't sit. He didn't speak. He just stood there, frozen, his hands clenched at his sides as if the very air had turned against him. Amara gathered her papers slowly, methodically, then looked up at him one last time. "I didn't ask for this assignment," she said, her voice softer now, but still filled with resolve. "But I'm not sorry I got it," and with that, she walked out of the chamber, not as the woman dragged from a courtroom weeks earlier, but as the one who had come back to take it apart, piece by piece. But what neither the committee nor MacArthur knew, was that this was not the end. Because Amara hadn't come back just to hold him accountable, she had come back with one more revelation, a final card to play, and when that card was laid down, when the truth of just how deep his betrayal had run was revealed, the entire courthouse would never be the same again. The door had barely closed behind Amara when a voice called after her, not loud, not aggressive, but laced with something heavy. A tremor. Something old. "Wait." She stopped in the hallway, her heels silent against the polished floor, and slowly turned. Judge MacArthur was standing just inside the threshold of the chamber, but there was no more arrogance in his posture. No more certainty in his tone. For a moment, he looked like a man stripped bare, lost in a place he once ruled. The hallway was empty save for them, the echo of murmurs fading behind the closed doors. The silence between them now was loaded, electric, but different from before. This was not a silence of intimidation. It was the calm that follows the breaking of something that cannot be put back together. She said nothing at first, just watched him, waiting. He stepped closer, his voice quieter, more deliberate. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You waited. You planned this." He was trying to reach for blame, but his words had no strength behind them. They fell, fragile, like glass already cracked. Amara's eyes didn't blink. "I followed protocol. You just never imagined I'd be in the position to use it," he scoffed slightly, looking away as if trying to find solid ground beneath his feet again. "You came into my court pretending to be someone else. You hid who you were." Her reply came without pause. "No. You assumed I was no one. And I let you believe it." That cut deeper than she expected. His expression shifted, and for the first time, his age showed, not in wrinkles or posture, but in the way he seemed to sink slightly, the weight of decades of unchecked power now pressing against his chest. He shook his head. "You don't understand what it's like to sit on that bench. The pressure. The responsibility. The cases that come through day after day, the filth, the lies. You think it's easy to stay clean in a system like this?" Amara stepped closer now, not with aggression, but with the kind of presence that couldn't be ignored. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being accountable. It's about understanding that your position is not a throne, it's a service. And you used it to crush people instead of protect them." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe deep down, he had always known the reckoning would come, just never thought it would wear her face. He looked at her for a long moment, eyes narrowing slightly, like something old had surfaced in his memory. Then he spoke, softer this time. "I taught a class at Columbia Law. Years ago. Civil procedure. There was a student, brilliant, always prepared, always pushing back, too much, some said. I remember I gave her a B- once, told her she was too argumentative. She stayed after class and told me she didn't need my approval. That she was going to outwork every expectation placed on her." Amara didn't respond right away. The air thickened between them. "That student," he continued, "her name was Daniels. I remember now. You were her." She nodded slowly. "And you never forgot the way I looked at you." Her voice was steady, but something flickered behind it. A wound revisited. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head again. "I thought I was challenging you. Pushing you. You weren't like the others. You were too sharp to be coddled." Amara's expression hardened. "No. You thought I didn't belong. And you tried to make me prove otherwise every step of the way." MacArthur leaned against the wall now, his confidence unspooling into something more raw. "You think you've fixed anything by doing this? That you've undone the system?" She looked at him, not with pity, but with a kind of mournful clarity. "No. But I made a crack in it. One big enough for others to see through." He stared at the floor for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then, In a voice that was barely audible, he said, "Do you hate me?" It was the kind of question a man asks not expecting absolution, but fearing the answer. Amara took a deep breath. "I hate what you chose to be. I hate that someone like you was allowed to shape lives and laws while pretending it was all about justice. But hate? No. That's too easy. I remember everything. The way you dismissed me in class. The way you dismissed me in court. And now, the way you're looking for some version of forgiveness. But that's not mine to give." Her voice softened only slightly. "What you need isn't my forgiveness. It's your own." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if the words bruised and soothed all at once. Then his voice dropped to something hollow. "They're going to take my title. Maybe my pension. My name won't be on that courtroom anymore." Amara nodded slowly. "That was never yours to keep. Titles can be stripped. Legacies can be rewritten. But what matters is what you do now. Not for your reputation. For the people you hurt." He let the words hang, unsure how to receive them. And for once, he didn't have a rebuttal. As she turned to leave, he said something unexpected. Not loud. Not defensive. Just, real. "You were right, you know. That day I had you taken out. I saw it in your eyes. I'd picked the wrong one to silence." She paused, her back still to him. "No. You picked the wrong era. The silence ends here." As she walked down that corridor, her steps felt different. Not lighter, but grounded. She had faced him. Not as the victim. Not as the prosecutor. But as something even more powerful, the embodiment of the system he had never believed would turn against him. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't demanded revenge. She had delivered truth. And in doing so, she had carved a path not just for herself, but for every black woman who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet in rooms where she was the most qualified voice. But what came next wasn't rest. There was still more to do. Because MacArthur wasn't the only one. And in the files she held, in the voices still waiting to be heard, there were more names. More stories. And now, she had the power to bring them into the light, but even she didn't expect what would be waiting on her desk that evening: a sealed envelope. No return address. Just her name typed in all caps inside it, a document, a list, 10 other judges all tied to the same pattern, and at the top of that list, scrawled in ink she recognized from her audit training days, a note from someone high above her: "They protected him for a reason. Dig deeper." What you uncovered was only the beginning, and suddenly, the weight of the past few weeks shifted. This wasn't about MacArthur anymore. This was much, much bigger. The echo of MacArthur's confession lingered in the corridors long after Amara had left him standing alone. Outside the courthouse, the day had turned heavy with the kind of gray clouds that don't rain but threaten to. The world looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted. News of the suspension spread fast. By the time Amara returned to her office, messages had flooded her inbox: congratulations, cautious admiration, whispers of fear, quiet gratitude. She read none of them. Not yet. Her eyes were fixed on the envelope still sitting at the edge of her desk, its seal already broken, its contents unfolding like a new chapter she hadn't asked to read. The list was precise. 10 judges. All connected. All showing similar patterns of judicial bias, procedural manipulation, or unethical decisions buried under technicalities and bureaucratic red tape. Each name came with a short summary, enough to paint the outline of a problem she could no longer ignore. But it wasn't just the judges. Handwritten in the margin was a name she hadn't seen in years: Harold Brenner, a man who once mentored her briefly during her clerkship in Washington. He had been a powerful figure at the time, advising ethics boards and judicial review panels. She remembered his firm handshake, the way he listened without blinking, how his praise always carried weight. What she hadn't known then, what was now implied in that one chilling note, was that Brenner had been a key player in protecting men like MacArthur. Not out of loyalty, but for strategy. Influence. Control. Suddenly, the weight of everything came crashing into view. MacArthur hadn't been an isolated case. He was part of a carefully protected structure. And now, she stood at a precipice. She could submit her report, let the suspension ride, and return to the quiet of procedural reform. Or, she could keep going. Tear deeper. Put everything at risk, her position, her safety, her future. Because exposing one judge was protocol. Exposing a network was war. The next day, she didn't show up at the courthouse. She flew to D.C. instead, quietly. No press. No announcement. She had only one meeting, one destination, an address on Connecticut Avenue, written in the same handwriting from the margin of the report. When she arrived, she found herself standing outside a nondescript building with no sign. A private law firm that didn't advertise, didn't solicit, but served the most powerful people in the country. She stepped into the lobby and gave her name. The receptionist didn't blink. She was expected. The room she entered was more like a library than a conference room. Lined with books, warm lighting, glass carafes of water untouched at the center of the polished table. At the far end sat Harold Brenner. Older now, but unmistakable. His posture still composed, his gaze still calculating. He didn't smile as she entered, only gestured for her to sit. There was no small talk. He opened immediately. "You were never supposed to go this far," he said, not with anger, but with a kind of tired disappointment. "We placed you in Richmond because we believed you could be a fair inspector. Precise. Focused. You weren't meant to pull the whole thread." Amara didn't flinch. "Then you underestimated me." Again, Brenner leaned back slightly. "You think what you did was justice? You made headlines. You created chaos. And now every judge in that region is watching their backs. That isn't oversight. That's fear. And fear breaks institutions." She shook her head. "What breaks institutions is silence. Complacency. Power unchecked." He raised a brow. "And who checks your power now, Amara? You realize if you continue down this road, there will be consequences. Not legal. Not overt. But very real. The kind you don't see coming until they're already written into your career path. Into your reputation. Into your future." She leaned in slightly. "If that's meant to scare me, you've misread the room." Brenner sighed, as if disappointed more than threatened. "There are reasons we allow certain things to remain hidden. It's not always malice. Sometimes, it's protection. Sometimes the system survives by quietly letting the rot stay buried." She stared at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Then it doesn't deserve to survive." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been. Brenner didn't respond. He simply slid a folder across the table. "This is the rest of it. Everything you wanted. Everything you were never meant to see. Do with it what you will. But know this, when you start pulling down pillars, eventually the roof comes down too." Amara took the folder and stood. Let it fall. Back in Richmond, the courthouse was already changing. MacArthur's nameplate had been removed from his courtroom. Clerks who once avoided eye contact now walked taller. A new temporary judge had been assigned, a young Latina named Camila Reyes, who introduced herself to every staff member by first name and brought donuts on her first morning. The air was different. Lighter. But Amara knew it was temporary. Symbolic. She had seen enough to know that unless the roots were dug out, the flowers meant nothing. That night, in her apartment, she read through the contents of the folder. Hundreds of pages. Connections between federal reviewers, political donors, judges who had sat on panels they should have recused themselves from. Patterns of suppression. A blueprint for systemic exclusion disguised as bureaucracy. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the sheer volume of it. This wasn't about one court. It was about the whole frame. And yet, beneath it all, a question clawed at her. How far could she go before becoming part of the machine she was trying to dismantle? What lines would she have to cross? And what if exposing the truth didn't lead to change, but chaos? In the quiet of her home, the weight of moral complexity settled on her chest. This wasn't just about MacArthur anymore. It wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility. About what justice meant when the entire system was shaped to protect itself. She wasn't naive. She knew whistleblowers often became ghosts. But she also knew that ghosts have power, because they haunt. She thought about the students who would one day read about this in textbooks, about the young black girls in law school right now watching this unfold, not knowing whether to feel hope or fear. She thought about her parents, their sacrifices, the nights her mother graded papers with swollen hands, the days her father came home in silence after cleaning government buildings where people like MacArthur held meetings about ethics. They had taught her something Brenner never understood: dignity is not inherited. It is chosen. Fought for. Protected. Amara stood from her desk and looked out the window. The city lights flickered like quiet sentinels. Somewhere out there, more names sat behind benches, wielding power in the shadows. She could name them now. She had the documents. But releasing them would come with consequences no folder could prepare her for. Not just for her, but for those she worked with, those who believed in her. The committee. The staff. The people who still believed the system could be redeemed. She would have to decide. Soon. Not whether to act, but how. Whether to light the match slowly, or drop it and let the fire speak for itself. What happens when the person trusted to preserve justice finds that justice is a facade? What does she owe, to the people, to the law, to herself? And can you destroy something rotten without burning your own hands? Those were the questions now, and the answers would define everything that came next. It was well past midnight when Amara found herself pacing the small living room of her apartment, the file Brenner had given her sprawled across every surface like a crime scene. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every page she read, every name she recognized, every signature that had once represented law and order now tied to manipulation and silence. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She had always known the system was flawed, but this wasn't just flawed. It was designed to be impenetrable. A fortress built not to protect justice, but to control it. She rubbed her temples, her mind racing. For the first time since this all began, she felt truly alone, not because no one supported her, but because no one else carried this particular burden. She was the only one who could expose it, and the only one who would have to live with the fallout. When her phone buzzed, it startled her. She wasn't expecting a call, not at this hour. She picked it up without looking. The voice on the other end was familiar, and soft. Miguel. Her colleague, the only person who had stood beside her from the beginning. He asked if she was still awake. She didn't need to answer. He already knew. His voice lowered. I saw your light from the street. I'm outside. She opened the door, and he stepped in, his expression a mixture of concern and understanding. He didn't say much at first, just looked around at the papers, the faces, the timelines taped to the wall like a prosecutor's war room. He let out a long breath. Jesus, Amara. How deep does this go? She met his eyes. Deeper than I thought. Deeper than anyone thinks. This isn't just about one courthouse, Miguel. It's national. It's connected. These judges, these decisions, they're coordinated. Protected. There's a structure to it. A design. He stepped closer, flipping through one of the pages. And you have all this now. You could bring it forward. Blow it wide open. She nodded slowly, her voice a whisper. And lose everything in the process. Miguel sat down, elbows on knees, fingers steepled. So what are you going to do? She looked down at the floor, eyes distant. I don't know. If I release it, they'll say I went rogue. That I abused my role, that I was emotionally compromised. They'll tear me apart in the media, in court. I'll never work again." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, "But if you don't, they win." Again, she turned away, fighting the sting behind her eyes. "I'm so tired of always having to choose between survival and truth. Why is that our choice, Miguel? Why do we always have to burn ourselves just to get someone else to see the fire?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew. Because that's what it had always been. For people like them, justice was never just about laws. It was about endurance. Sacrifice. Loss. After a long silence, she walked to the window, staring out at the quiet city. "There's something else," she said. "Something I haven't told anyone yet." Miguel stood, alert now. She turned back to him. "One of the names on the list, he's sitting on the panel that reviews my oversight performance. If I move forward with this, he'll be the one to recommend my dismissal." Miguel's eyes narrowed. "He's on your review board? That's a direct conflict. That alone is enough to." She shook her head. "It won't matter. They'll find a way to twist it. Say I'm retaliating. That I'm threatening the integrity of the judiciary. And if they pull me down, the others get away clean." He paced now, frustration radiating from him. "So what? You do nothing. You bury it all. That's not you, Amara. That's not who you are." Her voice cracked, just barely. "I don't know who I am anymore, Miguel. I'm tired of being the symbol. The strong one. The unbreakable black woman who carries the weight of an entire system on her back. I just want to breathe." For once, the vulnerability in her voice silenced him. He crossed the room and pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "You don't have to do this alone. We'll find a way." Together, later that week, she sat before the Federal Review Panel, her official quarterly evaluation scheduled as routine. But the room felt anything but routine. There were 5 of them. All men. 4 white, 1 black, older. The air was thick with formality and unspoken agendas. They asked her questions about procedure, about timing, about whether her judgment had been compromised during her investigation into MacArthur. She answered calmly, factually. But her eyes stayed fixed on the man seated in the center, Judge Malcolm Price, the same name on the list she'd received. The man responsible for reviewing not only her decisions, but her future. As the session ended, Price stood and addressed her directly. "Ms. Daniels, you've done commendable work. But I would caution you against continuing down a path that places your personal convictions above the integrity of this office. Oversight is about maintaining balance. Not creating spectacle." She met his gaze, unwavering. "With all due respect, Judge Price, balance without accountability is just stagnation. And integrity without truth is a lie dressed in robes." His smile was tight. Dismissive. "We'll be in touch." Outside, Miguel was waiting. She didn't need to say anything. He could see it in her face. The walls were closing in. They weren't going to take her down openly. They were going to suffocate her quietly. Strip her influence piece by piece until she was just a name on a forgotten report. That night, she called Carmen, the former clerk who had first given her the thumb drive. Carmen had left the city, moved 2 states away, working now at a small nonprofit legal aid office. Amara thanked her again, told her how important her courage had been. Carmen hesitated, then said, "If you need me to testify, I will." "I'm not afraid anymore." Amara smiled softly. "You don't owe me anything. But thank you. That means more than you know." The next morning, Amara sat at her desk and stared at the list again. The names, the dates, the links. And then, with a deep breath, she opened a new file. A draft. Not for the board. Not for the committee. For the people. A public report. Whistleblower documentation. She began typing. Slowly, then faster. The truth spilled onto the page like water bursting through a dam. Every connection. Every incident. Every manipulated outcome. It was all there. And at the top of the document, in bold, when the system hides itself behind law, justice must speak louder. She didn't know what would happen next. But as she typed, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not peace. Not safety. Conviction. And that would have to be enough. For now. The city moved like it always had, unaware that somewhere, in a quiet apartment lit by the glow of a laptop screen, something irreversible had just begun. Amara stared at the blinking cursor on the final line of the report, her heart pounding beneath her skin like a drum of quiet revolution. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. She'd worked through the night, every word typed with surgical precision, every sentence triple-checked for accuracy. The report was no longer just a document, it was a weapon. And once released, it would take on a life of its own, unstoppable, uncontainable. She knew what she was risking. Reputational assassination, professional exile, legal retaliation. But she also knew what she was protecting. The truth. The dignity of people erased by the system. And the part of herself that refused to sit still in the face of hypocrisy. She saved the file under a name she had thought of only hours before, the bench beneath. Then she encrypted it, uploaded it to a secure cloud, sent a copy to 2 lawyers she trusted, and scheduled the release for sunrise. She wasn't naive. She had read too many whistleblower stories to think this would be clean. But she would not be silenced. Not now. Not after all of it. When the first notification lit up her phone, it was just after 6 a.m. A single tweet. Then 3. Then 50. Then trending. Hashtags started appearing, hashtag the bench beneath and hashtag justice exposed. By 8 a.m., 3 national news outlets had picked it up. By 9 o'clock, she was being called by journalists she hadn't spoken to in years, some asking for comment, some begging for interviews. She ignored them all. Instead, she sat by the window with a steaming cup of black coffee and watched the chaos bloom quietly below. At 10:15, her office phone rang. It was the chair of the Oversight Committee. His voice was sharp but restrained, like someone trying not to scream in front of a mirror. He didn't ask if she had done it. He didn't need to. "You've jeopardized your position," he said. "And more than that, you've destabilized a system we've worked years to protect." Amara responded calmly, "A system built on buried misconduct isn't stable. It's a lie." He didn't argue. He only said, "There will be consequences," and hung up. By noon, federal agents had entered 2 of the 10 courthouses named in the report. Judges were placed on administrative leave. 1 resigned immediately. The media began digging deeper. Former clerks, attorneys, defendants, people who had once been silenced, started to speak. Quietly at first. Then louder. A ripple becoming a wave. She spent that afternoon walking through the city, her phone off, her mind flooded with emotions that couldn't quite settle. Pride. Terror. Freedom. Grief. All tangled together in a way that didn't allow her to breathe easy. She turned a corner and found herself in a park she hadn't visited in years. She sat on a bench shaded by a tall oak and allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. A soft voice startled her. "You did it." It was Carmen. Amara opened her eyes to find her standing there, smiling, her hands trembling just slightly. "I saw your name on the report. I knew it was you." Amara stood and hugged her without words. For a moment, there was no war. No scandal. Just 2 women who had once stood on the edge of fear and now stood in the open, exposed but unafraid. Carmen sat beside her, staring into the distance. "You know they'll try to break you now, right? They'll say you did this for attention. For power. That you're angry. Difficult." Amara smiled, dry and tired. They already did. Years ago. Carmen looked at her, eyes full of something more than admiration. But this time, people are watching. And they're not turning away. That evening, as the sky dimmed into a soft gray haze, Amara received a message from an unknown number. Just an address. No name. Something about it didn't feel threatening, just unfinished. Like a door left open. She debated ignoring it. Then curiosity won. She drove there, the city lights flickering against her windshield, the silence inside the car too loud. The address led her to an old municipal building. She stepped inside, passed through 2 security doors, and entered a small conference room. Seated at the table was Judge Franklin MacArthur. He looked nothing like the man she had last seen standing defiant and ashamed in that review chamber. He was smaller now, or maybe just quieter. His suit looked older. His posture was tired. He motioned to the seat across from him. She sat. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence was no longer a battleground. It was a mirror. Finally, he cleared his throat. I read the report. All of it. I thought I'd be furious. That I'd hate you. But instead, I felt something else. Something I haven't felt in years. Amara raised an eyebrow, wary. Remorse? He nodded. And fear. Not of being caught. But of realizing that I wasn't the worst part. That I was just one thread in a bigger knot. And I let it stay tied because it served me. She leaned forward, her voice steady. Then do something with that. Speak out. Tell the truth. They'll try to dismiss it coming from me. But not from you. He looked down, then back up. Would it matter? Her eyes didn't waver. Not to the ones protecting themselves. But to the ones who've been waiting to hear someone take responsibility. Yes. It would. He paused, then slowly pulled out a flash drive and slid it across the table. There are things even your report didn't touch. Files I kept. Names. Cases I pushed through chambers quietly. I can't undo it. But maybe, this can start something better. She took it, staring at the small object that suddenly felt heavier than anything she'd ever held. Why now? She asked. His voice was low. Because for the first time, I see what justice looks like. And it doesn't wear a robe. It wears resolve. They parted without a handshake. Without final words. Some reckonings are too deep for closure. Back home, Amara plugged in the drive. What she found was staggering: undocumented proceedings, misfiled rulings, private communications between judges strategizing against specific attorneys. The corruption wasn't just habitual. It was systemic. And it reached further than she imagined. She realized then that what she had released was only the beginning. The first crack. And the dam hadn't broken yet. But it would. And when it did, no robe, no committee, no title would be strong enough to hold it back. She exhaled, steady now. She had crossed the point of no return. But in doing so, she had finally stepped into the truth, and the world was about to follow. The final weeks were nothing short of an avalanche. After the release of the second wave of documents, Amara's report began triggering federal inquiries that spread across the country. Courthouses that had once operated in silence were now echoing with the sounds of investigation. Judges once considered untouchable were placed under internal review or forced into early retirement. National media outlets could no longer dismiss the reality. The truth had shattered the illusion of an impartial system. But amid the chaos, Amara remained grounded. She refused all major interviews, declined awards and accolades, and instead focused on building something lasting. Not just exposure, but reconstruction. She began collaborating with civil rights legal organizations, grassroots justice initiatives, and young legal minds hungry to change the system from within. She helped launch the Integrity Law Fellowship, a program that placed lawyers of color into judicial clerkships and oversight positions. It became one of the fastest-growing legal equity movements in the country. As for the Oversight Board, its members, particularly Judge Malcolm Price, faced their own reckoning. An internal ethics committee, under pressure from external watchdogs and public outrage, initiated a private inquiry that revealed several conflicts of interest. Price was quietly removed from his position and replaced by a panel that included 3 women, one of them black. It was the kind of outcome no one had believed possible before. Systemic change rarely happens in fireworks. It happens in silence, in shifted power, in names quietly disappearing from letterheads. And that's exactly what happened. Franklin MacArthur, now living in a modest home far from Richmond, never returned to the bench. But true to his word, he released a written testimony. Not a defense, but a confession. He acknowledged the patterns, named the pressure he succumbed to, and called for systemic reform that prioritized accountability over loyalty. His statement, surprisingly, was published in the New York Law Review and used in several law schools as a case study for judicial bias. He never sought redemption in public. But in private, he spent his days volunteering with a local restorative justice program, teaching legal basics to formerly incarcerated men. He never asked for forgiveness. But he never stopped trying to earn something that looked like it. Miguel, always Amara's quiet partner in the storm, became co-director of the fellowship they launched together. He stepped into a role of national significance, becoming a key speaker in legal ethics summits and educational conferences. But he always said the same thing in every speech: none of this started with us. We just refused to stay silent. And we're not done yet. His bond with Amara deepened, not romantic, but a loyalty rooted in shared purpose. They had gone to war together and emerged changed, stronger. Family in the way only truth-forged battles can create. Carmen, the former clerk who had first risked everything by handing over those hidden files, returned to Richmond not as a clerk, but as a certified attorney. With the support of the Integrity Law Fellowship, she passed the bar and started a community-based legal clinic for underserved populations. The same courthouse that once dismissed her was now a client referral partner. She would sometimes pass by the halls where she once felt invisible, and now she was greeted with respect. The quiet ones, they always said, are the ones you should watch. Carmen proved that twice over. And Amara? She became something no one saw coming. After declining multiple offers for judicial appointments and government positions, she accepted a role that allowed her to do what she loved: build. She became the National Director of Legal Accountability Reform, an independent watchdog agency created in direct response to her report. She no longer just reviewed misconduct, she shaped the future of how justice would be measured. Under her leadership, the agency passed the first federal initiative to create uniform transparency standards for all state and federal judges. For the first time in history, a database tracking judicial bias, public complaints, and disciplinary action became law. She didn't celebrate loudly. There were no parades, no grand declarations. Her joy came quietly, in the eyes of students she mentored, in the thank you notes from families who finally felt heard, in the weight she no longer carried alone. Her name became synonymous with accountability, but she never stopped being what she always was, a woman who simply refused to bow to injustice. But perhaps the most surprising twist came 2 years later, during a keynote speech at a major civil rights legal summit in Washington, D.C. Amara stood on stage, prepared to speak about policy, when she paused, looked out at the crowd, and said something unexpected. If you had told me 10 years ago that my silence would one day become the most powerful sound in the room, I wouldn't have believed you. But I've learned something through all of this. Power is not in how loud we are, it's in how precisely we use our voice when it matters most. The room fell silent. Then it rose with applause. But the message wasn't about her. It was about every person who had been silenced, ignored, erased. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, that they didn't belong, that they weren't allowed to challenge the system. And now, to you who listen to this story, what does justice mean to you? Is it punishment? Accountability? Redemption? Is it quiet, like a file that finally sees the light? Or loud, like a woman being dragged from a courtroom and returning to run it? Think about the systems you've accepted. The silence you've tolerated. The lies wrapped in professionalism. And then ask yourself this: if you had the power to change it, would you? Because sometimes, the system doesn't need permission to break, but it will always require courage to fix. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think about justice differently, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Amara's place? What does accountability look like in your world? And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this, true battles of truth, power, and resilience, make sure you subscribe to our channel, Tales of Twist, because the next story might be your own.